there is constant external noise into what is meant to be this kind of perfect image. And often, our diets influence our inner narrative, our search for self-worth, our external pursuit of what like perfectionism is. But actually realizing that to be human is to be completely imperfect is the biggest thing that we need to keep coming back to, that there is no perfectionism. We are all living on this world completely imperfect. And actually that is the beauty of what makes us human. But we've come to an understanding that we have to be perfect to fit in. And actually we've got to be imperfect to fit in.
Welcome to Radical Vitality, a podcast dedicated to helping you find more health, joy, and radical vitality in body and mind, despite the challenges of modern life. I'm your host, Kanchan Koya, a PhD in biomedical sciences turned cookbook author, health and nutrition coach, and passionate advocate of the use of spices, functional foods, nutrition, and lifestyle for better health. Join me and top experts in women's health as we navigate what has become an all too complicated landscape when it comes to health and wellness, so we can get down to what really matters so you can enjoy that life of radical vitality you so deserve. Now, on to today's episode. Hello, everyone, and welcome to another episode of the Radical Vitality Podcast, where we share tips and tricks and wisdom and insights to help you live that life of radical vitality you so deserve. My guest today is Sarah Ann Macklin, who had a life we would all envy. She was an internationally recognized model, the face of Burberry, and walking some of the most well-known runways in the world. On the outside, she looked beautiful, amazing, radiant. But on the inside, she was unwell. And she didn't even realize this until she ended up in a hospital. And this led her to realize what true health and wellness really means and inspired the work that she does today. Sarah Ann Macklin is an award-winning AFN accredited nutritionist, founder of the Live Well, Be Well podcast, which is the top 2 UK health and wellness podcast, and the Be Well Collective. She's also a TEDx speaker, international model, and health journalist, and was named Woman of the Year in 2019 by Rake magazine. Drawing from her 15 years as a successful international model, Sarah identified the lack of nutritional guidance for young women and men in her industry. This inspired her to establish the Be Well Collective, which has since hosted educational summits, workshops, and mentoring programs for over 5,000 young people. Sarah's TED Talk, Our Models, Role Models, solidified her role and her expertise as a public speaker on physical and mental health. She has contributed to esteemed publications such as the Financial Times, Telegraph, Evening Standard, Women's Health, Esquire, Mr. Porter, and Harper's Bazaar. In this conversation today, Sarah and I talk about what it means to be truly well, how size and appearance has nothing to do with health and wellness or our self-worth, how true self-care is about self-respect and compassion, how it has become so difficult to navigate the modern food environment and to tap into that intuition that should really be our guiding force when it comes to nourishing ourselves, and how we can reconnect with that inner wisdom. You're going to walk away inspired to take care of yourself better, to disassociate yourself from size and appearance and really focus on how you feel and how you show up in the world. Sarah is beautiful and wise from the inside out, and she shares so much incredible, actionable advice with us today. I can't wait for you to listen. Without further ado, I give you Sarah Ann Macklin. Sarah, thank you so much for coming on to the show. I am so genuinely excited to have you.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm so excited about today.
People are going to learn so much, and we are going to dive into your absolutely fascinating origin story and how you came to do this work. But before we do that, you teach people about the 7 pillars of health. And I have to ask, what's one pillar that you think is the most underrated yet the most powerful?
Oh my gosh, you really put me on the spot there. That is hard. So 7 pillars. I created the 7 pillars because I found that there was not one vertical to me that really stood out, that actually it was all encompassing. And so many times in health, which I'm sure that you'll get, and all your listeners will probably agree, that we really focus on one narrative, one vertical, one outcome to kind of fix any problem or any solution that we need. So it's a hard question, but I am going to answer it. So, of all of the 7 ones, and they were developed, and 7 does sound like a lot, but I really fundamentally believe they all have such a big place to play. The biggest one, and it might shock people, is actually self-care. And I say that because if we don't look after ourselves, no other pillars will ever fall into place. And I really believe there has been such a misunderstanding around the world around the word self-care, for the reason being that self-care now is looked on as a bubble bath, or maybe I'll have a spa day, or these kind of like, a spa day is such a big thing. Self-care are daily moments that you can look after yourself like you would do your daughter or your dog or somebody that you cared about. And we can so often do that for other people, yet we put our emphasis on our self-care last. And self-care could literally be, I'm going to take a couple of minutes to take a few deep breaths, proper breaths to calm my nervous system. Self-care could be, I'm going to go outside and get some sunlight and walk around the block for a couple of minutes because I know that's really important for my back and my body and all of those things. Self-care is like incremental moments within the day. They're not these like grand gestures that we have to do to ourselves to make us feel special. They're literally things that keep us in check. And so if we don't have any self-care, it means that we have very little low self-love and very low self-compassion for ourselves, which then means that every other thing we do in our life is a bit more of an effort. So having that self-care as like your base, as I would say, how would you look after your daughter, your son, your niece, your best friend, is actually one of the most important things. Once we have that foundation, everything else becomes a bit easier. So for me, I'd actually say like, it's been very misunderstood, but I do think we do need to start having a conversation around that word a little bit more.
Yeah, that's so great. And, something that I read on your website where you talk about the 7 pillars is this idea of self-respect. And that really struck a chord with me because sometimes we can feel like self-care has to do with sort of this checkbox or this list of things we should do because everyone says we should be taking care of ourselves. But when we come at it from this place of self-respect, like we would respect the vitality and the health of our children, our loved ones, in the same way we can do that for ourselves, I found that was really a profound way to frame it.
It's really interesting, isn't it? Because even as when I was writing that, a lot of that also has to do with our internal dialogue. So self-care isn't also about going off to do these things and putting them in place. Self-care is also about self-respect and how we speak to ourselves. So again, I talk about it like, would you speak to your best friend in the same way that you probably speak to yourself every minute of every day? If I got everyone on this show to write down every single thing that has been coming to their head that's been negative in the last hour, they'll probably be quite overwhelmed by how much that can be. Like, I should have done that better. Why didn't I do this better? Or that internal dialogue of I'm not good enough, which we all have and we'll never be able to get rid of. But that is a self-respect. We wouldn't be saying this same internal dialogue to the people we love because we respect them, we honor them, we care about them. But yet we can say it to ourselves on a daily basis without any conscious recognition that that is damaging our self-care practice. So it goes really, really deep. And that's why I talk a lot about in self-respect, because for some reason it holds a little bit more gravitas, because we all want to be respected, yet we very rarely look at ourselves and how we respect our own self. So yeah, I think once we've got that, everything else can fall into place a little bit easier. But once we've lost that or we don't recognize ourselves in that area, I'd say that's the biggest pillar to start on.
Yeah, no, absolutely great. And I did put you on the spot, but I knew you could handle it. And you did brilliantly. So thank you for that. Well, we're going to dive into all 7 pillars and so much more, but I would love to understand your story. So how does one go like you did from being the face of Burberry, one of the biggest brands on the planet, an internationally acclaimed fashion model to now a holistic nutrition expert, a host of, the UK's most successful health and wellness podcast, and like a health advocate. How does that transition happen?
Yeah, it's a big transition, right? And those two worlds of fashion and health don't normally coexist. And that's definitely what I found. So I basically, when I was 16, I was actually 15, I was quite young, I was spotted by 3 agents in my hometown. So I live in London now, but I lived about an hour and a half outside of London. Grew up in a very kind of normal town, not connected to like the big city lights at all. And I had a tap on my shoulder at a pot festival. And it was Elizabeth Hurley's agent, Kate Moss's agent, people that were quite well known said, we're a modeling agency. We think you could be a model. To that point, I had no recognition that was ever an opportunity that was on my side. Within a week, I was signed onto the books, and within a few more weeks, I was starting to shoot for some of the biggest brands in the UK. And I was really lucky that I had a career that successfully took off quite quickly. So I didn't really have much time to really think about where I was going and what I was doing. I was just kind of taking this like huge opportunity of success that I thought would never have been an offer to me and rolled with it. And a bit of the backstory around that time is I wasn't very good at school. I failed a lot of my exams. I felt like I didn't really understand what was going on. So all of a sudden being recognized for something that I could be successful in, I obviously wanted to jump and go for it, as anyone would do, any career that you're kind of given. So I did. And I lived in Paris, and I lived in Milan, and I lived in New York for 5 years. And as you said, like I shot for some of the most like well-respected brands in the world. But when I look back on it now at the age of, 21, 22, the outward kind of sphere that I had on looked like I was probably the happiest person in the world. I'd go back, see my friends at university, and they'd be like, oh, you earn lots of money and you're in certain circles and you live in New York and you've got all of this stuff at your fingertips. You must be so unbelievably happy. And in a way, I was incredibly grateful that I was given this opportunity and, being able to live in another country, and was able to be quite financially successfully free from a young age. But I was the most unhappiness, insecure, sad, lonely person I think I'd ever become. And to give a bit of context, there was so much glamour to that world, but there was so much unglamour. I never had a friendship group. From the ages of 16, I was traveling on my own every day to a different hotel room, to a different crew. Every day I was rejected for how I looked. And when that builds up over many years, all you remember is the negative thoughts. So when I was saying about how we speak to ourselves, imagine everyone saying that to you every day. So I was an insecure wreck of a self. I also had a lot of pressure that my financial worth was on how I looked. So all the time I was obsessing about making sure my hair was great, making sure I was thin enough, making sure that I looked correctly, presented myself correctly. Never figured out in any of those pivotal years who Sarah actually was. All the external information was drawing a narrative on who I was becoming, but I didn't know who that was. And slowly over time, very slowly, it just chipped away until one day I got onto set. I was taken off into an ambulance. I was put into intensive care. My kidney had failed. I had sepsis and blood poisoning all through my body. I had 5 reverse Burberry cysts. I had another one that was attached from my ovary to my bowel. I was diagnosed with an autoimmune condition in the hospital at the same time, and I was riddled with E. coli, all in that one day. And my body, basically what you would call now, had a habitual burnout. And I think burnout is used as a word too frequently at the moment. Real habitual burnout is when your body just says enough and it stops and it shuts down. And my body at 23 had shut down. My mind was still going. No, you've got to get better. Success. You can't fail at this. But my body had stopped. It had completely stopped. And at this point, I'm trying to think of what this would be in pounds, but I was about 5.5 stone, which is really, really low. I'm trying to think what that might be in pounds, but it was half the weight that I am now. I mean, it was like dangerously low. And that wasn't because I had an eating disorder. That was because I was under severe amounts of stress that I didn't eat properly. I didn't function correctly. I was shaking. I had so many panic attacks and anxiety, but I didn't know what any of this was because I was in an ecosystem where everyone around me was under a similar pressure and it was all quite normalized. And so by that point, after 6 months of coming out of hospital and getting back to a better state of health, I went back to New York. I got a call from my mother halfway through the day. I was cycling around Central Park, and she told me my dad had a brain hemorrhage and he wasn't sure if he was going to make it. And at that point, I knew I needed to get back. It was the first time, this might sound really strange to anyone who's listening, and I'm not sure if anyone's ever gone through a huge moment of disassociation in their bodies, but that's what had happened to me. I had totally dissociated from who I was. And it was the first time in about 6 years that I'd had a really intense feeling all the way through my body. It was like my body had known the intuition of just going back home. All I had to do was get on a flight. And I remember speaking to my agent in New York and saying, I really need to get back because my dad might not survive. And they had tried to tell me that instead of going back straight away, which is obviously the right thing to do, I should do a big job that's coming up tomorrow and then go home. And for me, that lacked any empathy or compassion around something that was actually a really inherent value of mine, which was my father. And I realized in that moment that I had not been living any type of truth. I had not become associated in my body. I was so dissociated from what my needs were. I didn't know who I was. I didn't know what I wanted. I didn't know what was important to me. And it was the rise of social media that year as well. So there was a lot more comparison, not just in my industry, but with everything else that was going on around me. And all I remember was getting on that flight and not knowing what my next step was, but all I had to do was see my dad. And he was in hospital for a couple of years after that, and his entire personality had changed. And I knew that 6 months earlier, I was in intensive care. And the consultant said to him, the reason why you're here and you've had a brain hemorrhage is because you're so stressed. And it really hit me that I'd never taken a moment to take a step back and think, the first thing wasn't my wake-up call, but the time my dad was in hospital, I was about to lose him, that was my wake-up call. And I knew the only thing I could do at that age of 23 was to go back to school and understand how I could look after myself. That was my only understanding of my next step. My next step was, I need to understand how I can feed and nourish my brain and my body to get me back to a state of association within myself and what my needs are. Because right now, my body is totally broken. And that was my first step. Now, this is way over 10 years ago, where nutrition wasn't spoken about, mental health wasn't spoken about, at least in the UK anyway. America, people were speaking about mental health, but not as frequently as it is today. It's now on an amazing level where everyone's talking about it and researching it, and experts are becoming kind of more and more known for the work that they're doing. But back then, it was not like that at all. And so I went back to school with an inherent fear of knowing what I said earlier. I was not good at school. And then I felt like I didn't fit in there either because I didn't really understand what was going on. And then I was told I was dyslexic, had neurodiversity. And that to me was the first time in my life that I'd felt seen, heard, and understood. Knowing that I wasn't stupid, I wasn't broken, I didn't only have one career in me, and now that was over, I didn't know what else to do. I actually knew that I was smart and I could get through this, but I just worked differently. And I had so much compassion for myself in that moment that it really changed my trajectory and how I looked out on things. And I got through my degree. I got a first, which I didn't think I was ever going to get. And that led me on to want to do more research into psychology of eating disorders and understand how the brain worked. And for me, my biggest mission back then was, I don't want anyone to feel misunderstood. I don't want anyone to feel not good enough. And I don't want anyone to lack self-worth and what they believe in that when it comes to their health mentally and physically, because I went to such a deep, dark place. And if I had had a little bit more of awareness, a little bit more support, I wouldn't be in the position that I was in. And so a lot of my mission today has been to drive that awareness, the empowerment, people feel seen, people don't feel scared of approaching these topics and going into that inner work. It's really, really important, because we all need to have human connection. We all need to eat some food, or we won't be here, and all of these things are derived from our self-worth. So if we can really start to kind of understand what our worth is, and we can feel seen, we can start to make better choices when it comes to our health. The problem is we kind of skip that part at school. And then we're driven by so many other external factors that end up shaping who we are. So a really big mission of mine is to bring those conversations through the podcast, Live Well, Be Well, to bring it through my platforms, to bring it through the food that I cook, really similar to you, how you get people cooking back in the kitchen, to like inspire people that they can do this for themselves and they are worthy. Every single person is worthy of their own love, and the biggest love that they can give is not to anyone, a partner or their child, is to themselves. And once that bit is in the part of the puzzle, everything else is a little bit easier. So that's kind of how I got to it.
Gosh, yeah, wow. What a powerful story. And I'm sorry you went through that. Sounds hard and dark, but it really sounds like you turned, as they say in some of the spiritual traditions, like you turn your pain into your medicine. And it sounds like that's what you've done. Like everything that you've been through that was hard for you, you've turned into like your offering now to the world so other people don't have to suffer, which is really inspiring and beautiful. And I was thinking about one thing. You were saying how when you were going through, like you were in the fashion space and you were doing all these things that you didn't even think were weird, like, or, restricting yourself or just whatever, like being dissociated, not really honoring your needs and putting a lot of emphasis on appearances. Even though I think, people, not everyone is in the fashion world. I actually think now with the advent of the extent of social media's influence in our lives, it is so easy to find yourself or to almost curate an ecosystem that is reinforcing that narrative. So even if you're not in fashion, you're like, oh, I have to look a certain way because health looks like this and like fitness looks like this. And so there's this like sort of undercurrent of pressure, I think, for a lot of like young women, especially even older women, maybe depending on, your perspective and your circle and your ecosystem online. So I definitely want to get into how one can navigate that very insidious and potentially dangerous kind of space we find ourselves more and more now with the advent of social media.
100%. I could not agree with you more. When I started this journey, I did feel quite isolated in the sense of the heightened comparison that I went through. So I was even living with people and going for the same jobs as them. And I know that that might not be normal for most people. But now what is normal is the extent that we wake up, we all look on our phones and we all compare our lives to the other lives that we're seeing. That is what every single person can relate to. And I think that is exactly the same as what I experienced in the modeling industry. And it's interesting where you said around like different age groups and demographics. I actually think every single person goes through this, from a 13-year-old child who's going to school, who's trying to fit in and, create a mask of what they think is the perfect kind of way to act, to be cool and popular. But then you've got going into kind of your 30s where you feel like you've got to reach a certain threshold and keep up with certain friends and those kind of external groups around you. And then you've got people that are going through to be mums, first-time mums, and they have that external pressure of maybe needing to work, hold everything down together, look a certain way, do everything in every single form, and also have a really, really healthy lifestyle, but also make sure you're getting enough sleep but being an amazing mother at the same time. And then it goes through to kind of perimenopause, menopause, where you're meant to still keep holding it all together. You're still meant to be having that successful career. You're still meant to be maintaining a great relationship, even though you're going through one of the biggest hormonal shifts you will ever go through in your life that nobody seems to kind of recognize. Wherever you are, you're comparing yourself to a narrative, an external narrative to fit in. And I think the biggest thing that we can understand is we shouldn't have to fit in. That's like the biggest thing that I think we need to understand, because when I tried to fit in to a narrative that wasn't me, my body broke down. And I learned that from a really, really early age. I tried everything to make sure the clothes were perfect on me, that everyone liked me, that I looked a certain way, that I acted a certain way, that I spoke a certain way. All of those things I tried to check off on a tech list, try to mask myself into every single narrative that was possible for me to be chosen. And it ended in complete disaster. And so the biggest thing that we have to fit in is into ourselves and into our own narratives. And that can also be quite a scary and lonely place to kind of start operating from. But actually removing that external pressure, which can be really hard because now we are bombarded with it every day, whether it's a TV program, social media, a magazine, a conversation at a dinner table. There is constant external noise into what is meant to be this kind of perfect image. And often, our diets influence our inner narrative, our search for self-worth, our external pursuit of what like perfectionism is. But actually realizing that to be human is to be completely imperfect is the biggest thing that we need to keep coming back to, that there is no perfectionism. We are all living on this world completely imperfect. And actually that is the beauty of what makes us human. But we've come to an understanding that we have to be perfect to fit in. And actually we've got to be imperfect to fit in. And that's what is really important.
I love that. Not trying to fit in, but to fit into yourself and recognizing, our imperfection as our humanity. I think that is such an important message, not shared enough these days. In fact, the opposite, very damaging message that, oh, yes, you can have it all. You can do it all, no matter the stage. It's interesting because you talked about your experience where your body broke down, and all I could think about, and we've talked about this offline, the mind body connection. So I would argue that in this quest for perfection, whatever stage you're at, and in this comparison trap, even if you're doing all the right things from like a nutrition and movement perspective, like you're getting your exercise in, you're doing your whatever, like your VO2 max training and your yoga, and you're working on balance, but then you're also eating all the right foods. But if you are stuck in this loop of comparison and this quest for perfection, I would argue that you are not healthy. Like your health is suffering.
You're absolutely not. And there's two ways I'd love to respond to that. One is, who are you doing it for? Because if you're doing it to keep up to an external narrative, that's your ego. And that's actually not healthy for you or anyone else, because the only person really that you need to make happy, number one, is yourself. And so if all of these things look or think like they're making you happy, but they're not, then what's the point in doing it? Is the number one thing, which we never question, right? Yeah, we're meant to be doing all of these exercises and keeping these steps in. But if I'm feeling drained and unhappy and burnout, what is the point? Who am I trying to support here? Am I really trying to support myself? Or am I trying to fit myself into an image that is expected of me? That's the really first big question. And then the second one you mentioned about mind-body connection. And it's something that I'm doing a lot of work on and research on at the moment, and has driven a lot of my work recently, is the mind and body are one. They're one thing. And we need to be looking at it as one sole thing, not two separate entities that kind of come together. It's one shape. And Ellen Langer talks about this a lot with her Harvard research. But what's really important there is, as you said, we could be having the best diet. I could be eating my 30 plant-based foods a week, check. I could be having my 2 liters of water a day, check. I could be doing my yoga 3 times a week, check. I could be doing some endurance exercise twice a week, check. I could be doing all of these things. But if I tell myself, which I did, and I'm sure many people do, because we're all imperfect, that we hate ourselves, or that we're not good enough, or I could have done better, or that was a really bad day today. Why did I do that? God, I look really fat in this today. God, really didn't perform very well today. Why did I shout at that person? Why did I lose my temper with my husband? Why did I react to my best friend? All of those internal narratives that we say to ourselves impact how we metabolize our food, impact how we exercise. And there's a really big kind of missing link here. And I say it because when you look at the research, our internal narrative also impacts all of these other elements of our health. There's a really interesting study that came out of Stanford. And basically, they put it into a randomized placebo-controlled trial, which is obviously like one of the highest studies that you can do under a meta-analysis. And they said to these two groups, totally randomized, so it wasn't true, we're going to give you 1 mil and you've got something called the FTO gene, which, to put it on scientific terms, is the fat gene, which I hate calling it, but everyone will resonate with that term that they've heard on these DNA tests. So you've got that, so you've got more of a chance of becoming obese. The second group, they said you don't have the FTO gene, so you're great. So you metabolize food really, really well. They gave these two sets of participants, again, totally randomized, didn't actually have these FTO genes, gave them the food. And what they found is after they told them this information, they both metabolized that food totally differently. But the food was exactly the same. And so when you think about that, if we're thinking about, I've got all of these checklists, but if I'm actually telling myself that I'm fat, I'm not good enough, I'm lazy, I'm not worthy, all of these things, it's actually going to influence how you're metabolizing that food compared to if you were telling yourself that you are worthy and that you are good enough. And all of these internal narratives that are really, really important for how we look at our health. And with the same set of groups, they did it with the endurance exercise. So again, they randomized them again. They made them go on a treadmill. They came back the next day and they said to them, okay, so we've done some blood work. You guys on this side, you have an endurance gene that makes you run fast. You've got a really good endurance gene. So to the other set of participants, you don't have that gene. So actually you really struggle with endurance exercise. You've not got that gene. They put them back on the treadmills again. And after they started running, the ones that were told that they had the good fast endurance gene overrun their personal best from the last time and the other group. The ones that were told that they didn't have the endurance gene underperformed their first test, simply by telling them that they were good enough to run or not good enough to run. Just by the simple language that we tell ourselves has a massive impact on how we perform. And we've thought about this in business terms, right? This is a really common mindset technique when we think about business. But when it comes to our health, we don't think about it. We're just told on what to do. But we've got none of the emotional infrastructure there, which is really important. And so when it comes to thinking about our health, it's not just having these checklists or making sure that we've got the right food in the house and the right time to exercise and enough time to sleep. A huge part of it is how we speak to ourselves. And so that's fundamentally a really important key, which is why I brought it back to the self-care. And I'm wondering if anyone's listening to this thinking, gosh, how many times a day do I rush my food down because I'm stressed and I've not got time to eat? Or how many times a day am I eating something and then I think, God, I wish I didn't eat that, and was really harsh on oneself about it? All of those internal narratives will affect how you metabolize that food and how it hormonally responds to you. So it's a really, really important question, not just for a health standpoint and a mental health standpoint, but having them together and for the outcomes that we kind of all want, which is to be happy and healthy and, not have chronic disease. But we don't talk about it.
Absolutely. That is so powerful. And really, the mind and body are one. And these studies are incredible in how they show that, those profound effects of what are we telling ourselves. So, I want to talk about nutrition because it's on everyone's mind. We live in a world where there is, on the one hand, so much information, sometimes very good information, hopefully, assisted by podcasts like yours and mine, where people can say, okay, I learned something. I'm going to put this into practice. This is going to help me, reduce my disease risk, feel more vital, all the things. There's also, unfortunately, quite a bit of misinformation, as we know. And you've talked a lot about this idea of like connecting to yourself, like reassociating with your body and knowing what you need. So if someone comes to you and they say, Sarah, I really want to feel healthier, I want to reduce my risk of chronic disease, I want to listen to myself, but I also feel like we live in such a different world from our ancestors. There is so much food noise. It's an obesogenic environment. There's like fast food at every corner. There's cookies, on every block. How do you navigate? How do you find that balance between listening to yourself, really honoring your needs, and also recognizing how sometimes that inner voice may be hijacked by our modern food environment?
It is such an important question. I'm so glad you've asked this because honestly, I think there is so much shame crowded in this space. There's this whole conversation on, do we have choice? Do we really have any choice? Well, the majority of us actually don't have as much choice as we think because, as you said, I think it's 3/4 of UK, and it might be very similar in America, are full of processed food in our shelves. And I know 2/3 in the UK, our shopping baskets by everyone is 2/3 of processed foods. It's really hard to go shopping and not to pick out those convenience foods because half of them are masked as healthy foods. So that's one really big thing that I want people who are listening to think, it's not just your fault if you're struggling with this. This is not to do with willpower. Willpower doesn't exist in our food landscape. And there's also something around people talking around the term intuitive eating, which I also struggle to come to terms with, because we're not living in an environment where our intuitive signals are playing the way that they should be. They're really confused in a landscape that is filled with fast food and convenience. And I say convenience because 20 years ago, if you wanted to get something, you would have to make a trip to the shop in time when it's open, come back and cook that food. Now I can order it on my phone. It can come to me in a couple of minutes. It's a totally different landscape that we're living in. We turn on the TV, we open TikTok, we've got 20 million viral views going on some type of sugary cake or cowboy candy, which I think hit like 20 million views recently, which is not something that's healthy to eat, that is full of so many processed foods and sugars. And so that's how we're kind of grabbing the attention. So trying to say to somebody, listen to your intuitive signals in your body, can be a real trigger for so many people, because a lot of people don't know what these intuitive signals are. They don't have the space and the bandwidth, because we're not sat in the countryside surrounded by crops and organic vegetables and cows mooing on the other side and water everywhere, where we think, what is it that I desire? We're bombarded day in, day out, and we're also at the highest stress levels we've ever been. So putting ourselves into this environment, as you said, is totally different. It really disrupts our internal hunger cues. And I would probably say to a lot of the listeners, are they aware of their hunger cues? Because many years ago, we were very aware of our hunger cues, but now they have become very skewed with intense work environments, start times, sleeping late, blue light, all of these things. So our hunger cues are naturally diminished. So if someone says to me, Sarah, I'm really struggling. I know what I'm meant to be eating well. And I do say this to most people. Everyone listening to this show who follows you for the reason of why you're inspiring and you bring color and light and joy to cooking, people know how to eat well. Okay, they know they're meant to be getting their fruits and vegetables. And I don't want to sit here and wrap off what we should be eating, because actually fundamentally we do know. We're all smart people. We all know. But there is a barrier into why we're not doing it. And that is what I'm really interested in. And so the biggest things that I start saying is, number one, why? Why do you want to be doing this? That's the first question that I ask any single person. I think that's the question you should ask, whether it's your diet or whatever thing you're going on to do. Why is a really important thing. If it's because of external reasons, then we need to rethink your why. If it's because you're feeling mentally quite low, you're not feeling yourself, you don't feel intuitive in your body, you feel vulnerable or scared, or whatever that reason is, and that's a really good place to start. So we try to dial on why. Why is it that you want to get to this external goal, that you're wanting to feel better in your body? What is it? The next thing I'd say is mindfulness plays a really, really big part in anything that comes with food. And so being mindful, everything that I've spoken about takes us away from being mindful. We don't actually have a connection to our bodies. When we're cooking, we're normally distracting ourselves with noise, conversations, something that's really, really quick and easy to do. So trying to be mindful will tap you into your internal cues of your body, and it can be really hard to do. So a lot of it starts with around being mindful and awareness. And then mindful eating really falls into that kind of bandwidth as well, trying to taste the food, feel the food, the sensations of the food, where at the moment that can feel quite boring for many people because we're wanting to constantly be distracted. So trying to bring ourselves back to that is really, really important. Textures, smells, flavors, all of that stuff is really important, but we've never taught to be mindful with our food. We're maybe taught to be mindful for 5 minutes in the morning, to breathe and to think about that. But then it kind of goes throughout the day. So we know that when we have that mindful perception, that our bodies naturally become calmer, that we are better to make informed choices about what we actually need rather than a reactive snap decision. What do I need for dinner? I'm going to have this. It's in my fridge. Sitting within my body, what is it that I feel like I might need? I'm not quite sure right now. Okay, what would I say to a friend on what they need? Trying to be mindful about that answer is really important. And it can take a really long time to get there because we're not used to doing that. So mindfulness is a really, really big thing. And there's so many ways that you can kind of help enhance that muscle in your brain that can grow. And the other thing is enjoyment, fun around what you're doing. And I know that you speak a lot about this, Kashan, with joy and everything that you do. But so many times I really feel, and I know we started off with a bit of a heavy story, but so much what I try to do and bring to my community is like the joy and the fun of everything. Because health doesn't need to be heavy. Okay, your diet doesn't need to be boring, sad, tasteless. Like, that is not how anyone wants to live. That is not how I want to live. That's how I did live before I had a full body breakdown, where I felt that I needed to suffer to be healthy. And actually, the fundamental part of being healthy is to be happy. We know that the people who are happiest have the healthiest, longest lives. Yet there's so much emphasis on healthiness being linked with sadness and deprivation and unfun, like all of those words that just feel very heavy. I kind of want to get away from. I want to bring joy and enthusiasm and fun and laughter back into health for people. And that's really, really, really key. Because when we've got that, we're so much more in tune with our bodies. We're so much more intuitive with what we might need. And then we start becoming more sensitive to hunger signals and actually how we're feeling. And so bringing that back into the recipe, alongside all the foods that we could talk about for hours that are good for our serotonin and dopamine and mental health and, things that work with our vagus nerve and our gut microbiome and all of those external factors, if we're not doing it from a place of joy and happiness, then there's something there that's gone wrong. And this is where we need to start. So I start by a lot of that on a somatic, like, understanding of someone's body, how they're feeling. And as I said earlier, the mind and body is one. There is one. And so how we're feeling is really important when we're approaching our nutrition. It's fundamental, but I think we've skipped that step, sadly, from the ancestral world of where we started and where it actually was very intuitive. And we have lost that. So bringing it back to the body is really, really, really key for me. And I'd say that to anyone who's listening, like, bringing it back to your body is really important. So mindfulness, fun, joy, creativity, and asking why is the place to start.
Absolutely beautiful and so powerful. Amen to all of that. And especially the joy piece and the lightness and the enthusiasm. And health does not have to be deprivation. Health does not have to be, suffering. And so I would love to get your view on how can we start to separate physical appearance and especially size from health. And I know you have done a lot of work in this space, obviously, given your past as a model and someone who was trying to fit into a certain size. And it's true that at some point we also have an obesity epidemic, we have a metabolic dysfunction epidemic. So two things can be true at the same time. We could have gone a little bit too far given our obesogenic environment where our health is suffering and there is a link to health and size. But we also know that you can be extremely skinny or slim and be very metabolically unhealthy. And you can actually be what might not look as super fit, but metabolically very healthy. And the science really tells us these are not always the same thing. So how do we, as women, especially at whatever stage in our lives, whether from teenagehood to motherhood to, perimenopause and menopause, which has major body transformations happening that are sometimes out of our control, start to kind of untangle this erroneous association that has become so ingrained that in order to be healthy, we have to look a certain way?
Mm-hmm. I think the biggest thing that I want to start with is your body does not define your worth. It's the biggest thing. How you look does not define in any way sense of your self-worth. Now, we've sadly come into, and I was in a real kind of like steroid environment of feeling like everything on how I looked and my shape and my body size was an extension of my self-worth, but it's not. And I think that's one of the biggest things to probably start with. And it's a really hard one, if I'm honest. It's really hard to sit here and say, we need to have self-compassion for ourselves. We need to have self-love. We need to build our self-confidence up from the inside. But if you fundamentally feel crap, it's really hard to get back because you're constantly triggered by all the external cues that are telling you this kind of perfectional ideal of what we're meant to be looking like. But it really does start from us. It really starts from us not placing that emphasis on what we look like. Now, you said two things that were really interesting there. Yes, we're hitting a problem with metabolic disorders, which means that we're suffering and we're dying now from chronic diseases that can be stopped due to our diets and our health and how we're looking after ourselves. They're not infectious diseases. We are now getting to a place where we're dying from poor diet and a lack of movement, which is really, really sad. But this does not define that if you are not a thin person, you are not healthy. Because at the same time, you could be in a really good shape but actually undernourished. And it can go both ways. You can be very thin and undernourished, and you can be overweight and undernourished. And I think that's the health parameters that we need to be looking at. So actually, if you are eating really well, and maybe you're not the size that you want to be, but you're eating really well, you're not having processed foods, then you are fundamentally a very healthy person. But if you are metabolically not stable and you are overweight and you're eating a lot of processed foods and your body slowly inside is not supporting itself because it is nutrient deprived, that's when we need to start really taking action. It's very similar. And I think people don't look at it sometimes in that way. Sometimes we look at somebody who's very thin and think they're very nutrient deprived. And yes, they are. But it goes both ways. It goes on the foods that we're consuming that makes us feel that way. And when we do get to that phase, what then happens is we're at much higher risk of depression. Our self-worth plummets because we just feel very low because we're not feeding our brains with the right nutrients that we need to support ourselves. So it can be even harder to build our self-worth up when our brains are malfunctioning because of the lack of nutrients that we're getting. So what I would first say is the biggest thing that I want people to start doing is actually looking at themselves in the mirror. And you can feel so silly doing this to start off with, but telling themselves that they're beautiful, that they are loved and they are worthy and that they love their body. And I know that sounds really, really woo-woo to say, but you have just listened to me earlier say what we tell ourselves impacts our cells in our body, impacts how we physically respond to everything. So I want everyone to know who's listening to this that they are worthy and they are beautiful. And they have to believe that. I can't just be saying this to you down an audio or on YouTube. You have to believe that. So it's starting off, not even with food, it's starting off by telling yourself in the mirror that you are worthy, that you're beautiful, and that you love your body. That is fundamental. Because if you can't love yourself, then no one else can be let into that barrier. So first of all, it's like really believing it. And the first day you'll feel a little bit silly. The next day you'll still feel a bit silly. But a month, 2 months down the line, you're probably going to start to believe that you are worthy and you are beautiful and that your body is epic. And that's the first starting point to really believe. And if you find that really difficult, I want you to imagine that you're telling your friend that in the mirror. You are looking in the mirror and your best friend is standing there and you are telling her that she is beautiful and that her body is wonderful. That is really, really important because sometimes it's easier and more compassionate to do it for others than it is for ourselves. But naturally, we'll start to be able to feel that we are. And when we build up that self-compassion, and this is where the body image comes in, when we build up that self-compassion, we start believing that we are worthy. And what that does is that means that we're able to start making choices that are right for us. And I say this in a way that think about having a child or a niece or somebody that you're looking after that you care about. Would you give that child every day 2 to 3 tubs of ice cream? You probably wouldn't. You'd probably say, you can have a tub of ice cream on a Saturday and you can have a tub of ice cream on a Tuesday because you're going to really enjoy that. And that's because I love you, because it's enjoyment and you love it. You wouldn't say, I'm going to give you a tub of ice cream 4 or 5 times a day or in every break because I actually know that I love and care about you and I actually want you to have that as an enjoyment in a balanced diet because that's really healthy. Yet when it comes to ourselves, we find those choices really, really inherently difficult to make, and they come a lot from an emotional perspective and also a lot of a place of low self-compassion. And so when we really start caring about ourselves and really start believing in ourselves, we can still have all of these choices at hand, but we're a little bit more aware of, I wouldn't do that for somebody that I love constantly because I know that's going to make them have a metabolic dysfunction in the end because they're not going to be able to process all of that sugar. So I'm going to have that on these 2 days when I'm going to really enjoy it and I love it. It's a very similar relationship that we have with ourselves that we do for our children or ones that we love. And so when we start becoming more accepting in our bodies, more accepting of ourselves, more compassionate and loving with ourselves, those images of our body, those choices that we then make on how we support ourselves become from a real place of actual love. And when we're making decisions on how we feel about ourselves and how we love ourselves, that's when a really healthy body image and love for oneself starts to develop. Very few of us actually have that. You might think we do, but very, very few of us wake up and have this real love and acceptance for ourselves like a partner would have for us. So I'd say to anyone who's struggling that starting there and knowing your worth is really, really important.
Yeah, so many pearls of wisdom there. So I struggled with body image issues. I feel like almost every woman at some point probably has, and when I was a teenager and really took like my 20s and 30s. And I would say I love the mirror exercise because what I do personally is I actually thank my body for everything that it does in my life. Like I really think being alive is a gift. And your body is like your instrument. It's your home. It allows you to do all the things that you want to do in your life. And we sometimes focus so much on how it looks and really not on how much it does for us. So I think this kind of, I've even done what they call like a naked mirror meditation, which can be really hard in the beginning, but where you're literally looking at yourself completely stripped and you are thanking every body part that you've probably judged for what it does for you. And I think that switch from like appearance to functionality and performance with a mindset of gratitude is a game changer. And I'm not saying it's not okay to have aesthetic goals. Like I think if you feel like, oh, I want to improve, but through the lens of performance and how you feel is, I think, where I have landed. So can I focus on improving my body composition because I know that more muscle is going to be better for my metabolic health? It's going to help me, carry a suitcase up the stairs. It's going to help me pick up my kids. And how I feel and how I perform becomes the main driver. And in the process, maybe I look a little bit fitter or whatever. Great. I'm not going to say no to that. But again, going back to you, like, why and what's the driver? Is it external or how you feel?
Yeah, the why is the biggest thing. I don't think any of us go in, why am I doing this? Why is this important to me? Why do I care about my body right now? And again, yes, muscle health, fantastic for mental health, really important for the functioning of our brains and our mental well-being and all of those things. Being able to go for a run, lucky enough that we can all have able bodies, if we do have an able body, to go for a run, being able to have a baby or anything that our bodies can do that is in human form is amazing. Being able to have these conversations that we're not paralyzed and we can sit here and have a very open dialogue and conversation. All of these things are such beautiful things to think about. And somebody did say to me, I remember I was having a really low time recently and I sat next to this guy at dinner and he asked me a question. And I actually just thought, I'm going to be really honest. And I just told him what I was going through. And I said I was struggling a little bit. And he sent me a voice note the next day. And I mean, I barely knew him. And he just said, every day you've got air to breathe in your lungs is a day to be grateful. And don't waste that air on anything else but yourself. And I just thought, actually, there are so many other things that I could be worrying about right now and not be here, not living and breathing. And actually having another day to have that air in my lungs, another chance to kind of reprogram my day, and however hard that is, having that air in my lungs is actually, it's a really beautiful thing, and it's really lucky. And just thinking about those moments that one day you won't have those air in your lungs, one day you won't have the opportunity to take that breath, is a really powerful thing to think about, because then it kind of stops you in your tracks of the rumination of whatever pain you might be going through. And all of it is worthy pain. I think every single person that is suffering, and whatever it is, it's there for a reason. But bringing it back to, I've got the air in my lungs to go through another day, was a really powerful sentence to me. And so allowing kind of that awareness as well, I think is a really powerful concept.
Yeah, I think that's so important that, we do sometimes have these heavy emotions and it's completely okay to allow them. In fact, we must, because otherwise they get trapped and they manifest in unhealthy ways. But at the same time, we don't have to drown in them. We do have the power to kind of transform them. And gratitude is a great, way, human connection. It sounds like two things that you touched on. You connected with another human being who was able to remind you that gratitude can help you get out of this place, this difficult place. You talk about human connection as a pillar. We hear about it a lot these days. I feel like it's like trending. But, I still think I had a guest on the podcast Dr. Sue Varma, who's a psychiatrist, and she said the statistic is that college students now are spending less than 40 minutes a day with another human being, like actually in person. And so, why did you put human connection as one of your 7 pillars? And how do you recommend in this digital age people start to really foster that more?
Yes. Oh my gosh. So loneliness has been one of the biggest factors of my life, which is why I put human connection on there. So loneliness was probably my first pillar of health when I came to creating them. So I did my TED talk on it about 9 years ago on loneliness and human connection. It's played a really fundamental part in my own life's journey, and I would say now more than ever it's becoming more of a poignant, trendy word, because we are sadly becoming more isolated than ever before, as you just read. And the reason why sadly teenagers are more lonely than the elderly people in the world is because we are being so removed and isolated because of technology and because of social media. And I think loneliness is a very underrated conversation. We talk about human connection, but you can still be surrounded, and I was, by loads of people, and I felt incredibly lonely. And I think that's the big thing, right? Loneliness isn't just about being on your own or being on social media. Loneliness can also be surrounded by all your friends and family that you know love you, and you have no connection there to them in that moment because you in yourself feel so isolated. And that's what I experienced. I experienced going to school and feeling like I didn't know what was going on, and I felt very stupid, and I was too scared to speak up, and I felt very isolated in all of those moments. But I masked it. I tried to pretend that everything was fine, and because I kept up this kind of pretension and this mask, I felt completely lonely. I had no idea what was going on, but I couldn't admit that to anyone, and I couldn't even admit it to myself. And then I went into another form of loneliness when I went to the modeling world, where I was lonely. I was living on my own. I didn't have anyone to share what was going on with. No one really understood the world that I was in. And so there was a different type of loneliness, that I was kind of removed from people, and I was put into situations where no one really asked me a question. No one really cared about how I felt. So I did feel very lonely. And then I've gone into like a different stage of my life of changing career, which again can feel incredibly lonely as you're in a transition, as I'm sure anyone who's gone through a career change at any point in their life has felt. And so there's been many different elements and layers of human connection in that. And I really believe that human connection, and we know from the kind of one of the longest studies ever to come out of Harvard, that the people that live the longest are the ones that have the most healthiest relationships with others. And that's not just a partner, that's with anyone within a community where you feel a sense of belonging. And I think that we're all losing a bit of sense of belonging. And I know I lost a sense of, where did I fit in? Where did I belong? Where is my tribe? And that, I think, is fundamental. It's not just surrounding yourself with people. It's actually where you feel a sense of belonging. And that's the connection that's really, really fundamental. That's what makes our dopamine go off. That's what makes oxytocin come out when we hug somebody. That's what makes us feel emotionally safe. And that emotional safety is so, so, so important for happiness and health. But sadly, we actually can disregard it quite a lot. And we can put in some plans in the week to try and see people. But how emotionally safe and connected do you feel in that situation and environment is actually one of the biggest things. Again, it becomes like a checklist. I'm doing all of these things, but am I connected? Do I feel part of that tribe? Do I feel seen by these people? Is really hard. And am I being my true self? Am I being authentic? Do people really see who I am, or are they seeing a version of me? Because if they're seeing a version of you, that's not a true human connection. You're not getting those emotions that are being met, which is really important for those neurotransmitters and all the kind of health kind of determinants that come out of it. So human connection is one of the biggest things, but I do think we're living in a more isolated way than ever before. So it's one of the most important pillars, I think, as well, on my 7 pillars. And I couldn't put in health without it, but I think it's a very complex one that is spoken about broadly, but actually there's a lot more to it. So yeah, feeling seen, connected, and part of a tribe is really, really important.
Yeah, we'll link to your TED Talk in the show notes. And people, when they check out your pillars, I know you have an inner circle membership, and you have, so many other offerings in your podcast and whatnot. So yeah, I agree. It's complex, but so important. Sarah, what's a wellness trend that you would love to see disappear? Putting you on the spot again.
Oh my gosh, what is a wellness trend that I want to see just fit? Gosh, there are so many. What would I like to see go? I would like. I was trying to think of something foodie, but I actually think it's probably going to be something a bit more emotionally driven that I would like to. I don't know. I just think that there is so much pressure on people today to be a certain narrative or a certain way. Oh gosh, I mean, I don't want to see Instagram go, but there's something around. I don't know. There's something around that, around the pressure on the lives that we're living that we have to construct. And it is a bit of a trend, it is that there will become a day when it is so inauthentic that actually it doesn't become a tool for marketing. And it isn't necessarily a wellness trend because it is damaging our health. And there's so many beautiful things to that's been created, that we've got this amazing access online. We can see people all over the world and we can find out an amazing array of information. But I think there is something to be said, and I don't know if it is a trend, but there is something to be said with the how we are viewing ourselves on social media that needs to go, because I think it's becoming really, really detrimental to others and ourselves.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. And, I think the younger generation is sensing how detrimental it is, because I've been seeing trends and I'm hoping that continues, where people are really managing their interaction with social media. Kind of like we were talking about the self respect and the self care around the tubs of ice cream, for example, or the fast food or the junk food. We can recognize that, a little bit of social media brings us pleasure. It helps us see what people are doing, it helps us connect with others. But too much is actually really having the opposite effect. And can we manage that out of that, from that place of self-respect and self-care?
Yeah. Yeah. I think it's fundamental, but it's hard. We have to put our own boundaries in, and that's hard.
So I could talk to you literally for days. This has been so incredible. I ask all my guests before I let them go. This podcast is all about cultivating a life of radical vitality. And sometimes that means doing things against the grain. It means, dissociating from these narratives we're being fed about what it means to be healthy, what it looks like to be healthy. And we've talked about all of that. What are some practices that you are currently working on or trying to improve on or really hone when it comes to feeling like your life has more radical vitality in it?
Yeah, you've asked me at a really good time, actually, because I think I'm going through. I mean, I've always, always, always been into all of this. Like, what can I do to help my personal growth? I've always been very curious in that sector, and it's been interesting because I've been very much in the scientific sector for so long, but I have a huge holistic side to me, and a spirituality side to me as well. And I try to really entwine them both and listen a lot more in my body. So things that help me a lot is somatic work, really getting into my body, that I'm doing a lot more at the moment. So I'm doing a lot more morning early meditations and body scans to really try to help settle into how I'm feeling. I am at the moment doing a lot of work on shadow work, which I'm finding really, really fascinating. And I think it's coming up a lot more, but leaning into that. And I think it can be sometimes a scary place to lean into your shadow, but I think it's a really, really important one to do to help you understand yourself a lot more. So journaling a lot around that and understanding what that is, and how I can kind of come more into that of myself and not feeling fear around it. There's a lot of like journaling work in that as well. And as well, for me, it's about making sure that every day I'm asking myself what I need, as opposed to being on a hamster wheel, which sometimes I can get into because I like to work a lot and my work is my passion. But actually taking a beat and saying, like, what is it that I need today that I can do that's not my work, that's going to help me? And I think that's a really, really important kind of life skill for everyone, is actually, what is it that I need today? It doesn't have to be big, but it needs to be asked. And so they're the kind of things that I'm implementing a lot at the moment that I'm finding really helpful.
Yeah, worthy efforts. Love it. So you have so much going on, so many incredible offerings to the world. Your beautiful podcast, you have your collective, you have your inner circle. Where can people find you online, and what are some things that you're working on that you'd love for people to know about?
Yes, I'd love you guys to come and say hi to me on the podcast. We called Live Well, Be Well. We're on YouTube. We're on all of like your, Apple, Spotify, wherever you listen to your podcast. We're a weekly show. Also, would love you to come and join over on my Instagram. I try to chat to everyone who comes on there. Lots of different content goes out every week. Sarah Ann Macklin. And again, as you said, the inner circle. If you kind of want more kind of content, blogs, recipes, all of that type of stuff, go into the inner circle membership on my website, which is Sarah Ann Macklin. So yeah, lots of ways you can connect.
Cool. Yeah, we'll link to all that in the show notes. And Sarah, really, thank you so much. I'm so happy we connected. We met in person before this, which I love. And yeah, everything you say, I resonate with so much. I think we need more of this message in the world, and you're doing it. So you are really, really making the world a better place. Thanks so much for coming on.
Thank you so much for having me. I've absolutely loved this conversation. So thank you, Katrin.
Thank you for listening to the Radical Vitality podcast. Be sure to subscribe so you never miss a new episode. It's also the best way to support the show at no cost to you. If you'd like to share your thoughts or feedback, let me know by rating and reviewing the show on your favorite listening app or leaving me a comment on YouTube. Until next time, stay spicy, stay healthy.